Well, thank you for having me here today. I appreciate the invitation and will do my best to kind of move around and hopefully you can hear me and see me okay. I just have Green on the slide here. There's another Andrew, the more famous Andrew is going to be on the slate here in a little bit. And I usually like to say that, I get to come here and represent the wheat breeding program, but there's a lot of people that work in our program, both collaborators across campus and also folks who work for me, who do a lot of the work that I'm going to be talking about today. So it's really important that we share credit with all of those folks. And I'll try to bring out a few of those references as we go through. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. So 2024 in wheat was a really interesting year. We had an estimated state record yield. There are always challenging spots. There's always some spots in the state that are better, especially in a state as diverse as North Dakota. I don't have to tell you folks that. I like to say that I think we navigated a landmine field of diseases. The potential for problems with a lot of different pests in wheat was very much there this year. And I know there were some issues, there were some challenges, but by and large, I think it could have ended up a lot worse than it did. At the end of the day, even with some of the harvest issues and some of the sprout problems, some of the protein issues we'll talk about today, the marketable crop quality for the international export market is pretty good. But the harvest issues are the things that I was asked to talk about today, and some of the things that we can control both through a combination of management and hopefully some good choices with genetics. So again, there's probably a whole host of you. Anybody could probably stand up here and give the first two slides of this presentation. What were the conditions like? Generally speaking, a wet, cool spring. We had adequate to excessive moisture through most of our early vegetative growth in wheat. This resulted in very high yields. High yields are good. The problem we ran into that I was asked to speak about today were some of the protein issues of harvest. So what caused our low protein issues this year? Somebody shout it out. You guys are smart. We had record state yields and really low protein. What happened? Maybe not enough fertilizer, maybe some nitrogen issues, could have been. It seems like some varieties just struggle to maintain their protein when we have really high yield potential. Has that been anybody's experience? Okay, good. So I had this, I don't have an extension appointment. I really enjoy getting calls and talking to farmers about how things are going. But I would say for the number of average calls I have this time of year, this was by far the most prevalent conversation I had. I grew this variety. I'm not leaving it anonymous to pick on anybody, but I mean, there was a handful of examples. I had a yield of this. I thought I fertilized for it adequately. Things were going great. Everything looked nice. Didn't see it coming, but the protein was really, really low, and I've never had this problem before. Did anybody have that situation? Few people? Yeah, it's okay to admit. So what could have been unique about this year? And some of this, I'm a wheat breeder, and in my role, I kind of have to act like I know a little bit about a lot of different things. So I had to borrow some help on some of the soil fertility issues here. I don't know if you've had a chance to meet Brady Gadel, our new extension soil fertility specialist. I ran some of this by him. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't going to lead anybody astray. So that's why I've given him some credit here at the bottom. So we had a lot of rainfall in a lot of the eastern part of the state. Mine have had a little bit of leaching as a result of that. We could have had enough cool conditions, cool soil temperatures through a lot of the early part of the season that maybe had some issues with nitrification from spring applied in. Maybe that soil just sat there and it was just a little bit too cold during a critical period of the growth season. One of the things that happens, and this can lead to other problems like lodging later on in the year, is you get that adequate moisture. The plants get a little bit lazy, if you will. You don't get the rooting depth that you often have. And so maybe they didn't get down into the zone where the nitrogen was after we had that early season rainfall that sort of pushed it down in the soil profile. So at the end of the day, we had yield promoting conditions. We had enough nitrogen to make really good yield. But at the end of this all, we had just enough that we ran out of nitrogen during the critical time when we're making protein. Once we switch over and we've elongated and we're making protein in the grain and we've sort of shut off that yield growth, we get a decrease in protein. Could have been any combination of these things. And it probably could have been single factors on some people's farms and others. Maybe we had a little bit of all of this going on. These are all speculation. Because getting data from this with the adequate soil tests and being able to prove any of this is a project, and frankly, it's not the kind of work that I'm really doing anyway. This is my speculation. So let's talk a little bit about, the trade-off between yield and protein. When we say we have a decrease in protein, what does that actually mean? Or an increase in protein? Where does it come from? So we want to increase protein. What does that actually mean? Are we increasing anything? Are we changing a ratio? So that increase or decrease in protein is related to other components of the seed, right? When we have heavy, full seeds from good yield conditions, a lot of times, what do we put our energy into? Or instead of protein, we're making what? To make a big plump kernel. Starch, yeah. We get heavy kernel weights, we get good test weights from strong yields, but a lot of times that's what happens with our relative protein goes down. So the percentage of protein in those seeds is less when we have those really high yielding conditions. So the other problem we have is that the yield response from available nitrogen is going to be less in dry years, right? We think of high protein years, those are usually lower yielding years. A lot of times that's from less relative moisture, less rainfall. But in wet years, that potential goes up. The crop runs short of nitrogen. We've got those big plump seeds, lots of starch, and the ratio of starch to protein gets off, and we get lower protein. Does all that make sense so far? I'm married to a soil scientist. That's about as we've now heard all of the soils knowledge that I'm going to profess to have for the rest of the day, and we're going to switch to genetics here pretty soon, I promise. Okay, so what do we need protein for? Who cares? High protein, low protein, what difference does it make? Okay, for what? Making bread, yes. So the protein is a vital component of gluten. That's what gives bread its functional characteristics. It gives it that texture that we need as an ingredient in making bread products. Why 14%? Where did that number come from? It's useful when they're trying to blend it down, that's true, but who came up with 14%? Food science is 14% the magic cutoff between good bread and bad bread? No, it's not. I have no idea why 14% came about. But you can make good bread with lower protein than that, but you can also make really bad bread with higher protein than that. And if that doesn't confuse everybody yet, just hold on and we'll try to confuse you again. So we've got to have a good amount of protein in order to have quality for the bread. It's a trade standard. You've got to do this 14% game to avoid discounts. I mean, we know we're not going to change the framework of wheat merchandising here. So let's just assume that 14% is our goal, even though it could be argued that it's arbitrary. Now, we know that we can do a little bit of manipulation with management to increase protein. Has anybody ever tried applying foliar UAN during grain fill? Yeah, it's hard to do. Sometimes it doesn't pay off. You've got to hope, even if you've done it right, that it doesn't look like you just sprayed it with paraquat, because that can be really damaging to the leaves. But a lot of times, I know it's an economic decision. Are we going to receive back the money that we invest in the crop when we do this? There are times, and I think there are certain varieties where it could and should pay off. And hopefully we'll see in the in the landscape of varieties we have now, there are some of these where you might actually be in good shape to do this. And I'm not going to sit here and say, try to chase the protein premiums because we know those are pretty hard to find, but the protein discounts are usually there, right? So where does that nitrogen go during the season? So why does the foliar UAN work during grain fill? Well, that's because during vegetative growth, which is everything before elongation here on this graph to the left, all your nitrogen is pretty much going to go to yield components. We're making more tillers and we're adding spikelets to those wheat heads to make longer heads. But then once we get into the reproductive stages of the game, past heading and on through grain fill, then we're making heavier seeds. When we make heavier seeds and we start to run out of nitrogen from the early part of the season, in a high yielding year, that's where we get that ratio of starch to protein gets off, and we start to see a decrease in our overall protein at harvest. So the nitrogen uptake here on this figure to the right, when it starts to boot, once we're just a little bit prior to head emergence and prior to anthesis, it's really starting to pick up, and then that nitrogen uptake really takes off during the reproductive stages of growth. So that's why that post-anthesis UAN can work. So we know there's a biological trade-off between yield and protein. If we make bigger, plumper seeds, heavier yields, the protein content goes down. A lot of times we say this is kind of fixed in biology. People take it as for granted. When you have high yield, you have to have lower protein, right? Is that true? Sometimes, but maybe not. So it's not true that when protein goes up, yield has to go down. That's not, hopefully if we take anything away from this, we learn that that's not the case. So the solution could just be pick a low yielding variety, right? Protein solved. Everything's fixed. Yeah, I would have been laughed out of here a long time ago if that was the case. Don't do that. So this is the figure that's got it. These are hard to see. I made this as big as I can, realizing that this room is still going to make this tough to see. So let's orient ourselves here. We've got grain protein on the y-axis over here to the left. So the lower you go on this figure, the lower the grain protein. Now this is data taken from 2024 to 2028, or 24, sorry, 28 total environments. So these are averages across all those years. Lower protein varieties, higher protein varieties. Your grain yield is on the x-axis here. So the further to the left you go, the lower the yield. The further to the right you go, the higher the yield. So if we're trying to maximize yield and protein, which quadrant do we want to be in? We want to be in the top right. So I'm not trying to sell you seed of any of these varieties up here in the top right. But I mean, you've got a couple of examples here. One of them is our recent release from our program, ND Stampede. 14.2% protein over this time frame, 75 bushel per acre yields. That's not what I want you to focus on. What I want you to focus on is this list of varieties here in this gray box. These are all varieties that have nearly identical grain yield over this 3-year period. LCS Trigger, LCS Buster, MS Charger, Stampede, and then Ascend SD from the South Dakota State program. But look at the protein difference. We're running anywhere between 12.2 down here at the bottom, all the way up to 14.3 with the same yield potential. These were taken out of the same trials. They were managed the same way. This is a balanced data set. And we've got a spread in protein difference here that's astronomically high. Typically, how much do we get from that post-anthesis UAN application if we're trying to do a rescue treatment? What's a good rule of thumb on how much you can pick up with that? Does anybody know or remember? Yeah, half a point. That's really all you're going to get to half a point. So you might be able to take your 12 twos here and turn them into 12 sevens, and you can spend a little bit of money on your high yielding wheat, but you're still going to get a discount. But if you come up here to the top end of this gray bar, you can be above 14% with the same yield potential. So we see this trend all over this graph. If yield and protein truly were always negatively related, all of these would be in a straight line going down. They would all be hugging this line. But we see variation all over the place. High protein, low yield, high protein, high yield, low protein down here on the bottom right. And then the bottom left is where nobody wants to be, which is low yield, low protein. And luckily, we don't have a lot of that floating around in the marketplace. So there's a lot of things that a management perspective a person can do, but there's a lot of issues that can be solved by just selecting better varieties. These data are all out of the statewide variety trial. You can go in and find state averages. You can look at the trials that are nearest you if that's more comfortable, and you can find things that have higher protein content to avoid having to run into this problem in the first place. Now, you're still going to have to pay attention to those conditions we talked about. Some of those factors with nitrogen management in a really high yielding year, you might still run into trouble. But if you can pick up 1.5 points just by buying a different lot of seed, I would argue that's a pretty good place to start. So good bread making lines must always have really high, strong protein, right? If we're trying to make the best quality possible, all we have to do is just pick a high protein variety. Well, it turns out that's not necessarily true either. I'm going to quickly go through a few slides from a graduate student at NDSU, Jose Baez, who's been doing some work. He's trying to look at how management affects both yield and protein with a set of 4 varieties. And he's looking at the end use quality of those when it's done to see if his differing nitrogen management rates and fungicide applications are having an effect on yield, protein content, and then what the end use quality does. So he's got 4 main treatment levels here. This is the control group where there's no additional nitrogen supplied. He's got low, medium, and high. The highest intensive management has 3-pass fungicide and split nitrogen. Post-anthesis UAN is included. This is the most money and effort you could possibly spend on your crop on the high side. He's got 4 varieties that he's looking at that all have a little bit different characteristics. So Faller, high yield. I don't know that I would say low, but I would say low to medium quality. ND Froberg, which is medium yield, medium quality. Glen, high quality, low yield, and then Valda, high yield, low quality. So he tested this over 2 years, 7 places, so 14 total environments. And what he found was, as your management level goes up, your yield increases, and so does the protein. Well, that's brilliant, right? We probably could have predicted that. But what was more interesting is when he starts looking at the variety choice amongst these different controls, different varieties behave differently. Some really take that nitrogen and they dedicate it all to protein. You get this high level here with Glen, and your yields have topped out at 68 bushels, and you're running 16% protein. That's, sorry, I thought there was a question. Somebody back there shouting at the seed dealer. Each of these has a different profile of how they manage yield and protein. But as the management levels go up, this changes a little. But what was even more interesting is looking from an end use quality perspective, he saw that when we got up to these medium and high levels with the more intensive nitrogen management, the low volume of these plots was better looking bread. And I'm not going to sit here and explain why these pictures are good and bad, because I'm not sure if I could. But the wet gluten and the milling yields went up as well. And so that obviously is going to be hopefully begging a question in most of your minds when you look at that high management level, what's the impact here? The second part of Jose's project is he's going to be looking at the economic simulations around each of these treatments. So he's going to try to pinpoint for different profiles of varieties, where is the best return per acre for, a variety that tends to have high protein or a variety that tends to be a yield racehorse? And what's the level of input where, given certain price assumptions, you have the best return per acre? So that's something that hopefully when he finishes this up over the coming year, now that his agronomic data is collected, we can share with you in the future. So in conclusion, I mean, I hopefully you knew this, but nitrogen management for your yield goal is critical. Now this can be soil testing, looking at split applications, post-anthesis UAN. Those really should all be on the table if you're looking to maximize return, but it's got to be within the economic constraints of the crop. Varieties differ by protein. Even at the same level of yield, some varieties will keep their protein high and others are just sort of doomed to that bottom of the figure where they're down in the 12s and 13s. Protein quantity doesn't necessarily predict baking quality. And then from Jose's project, yeah, we put more nitrogen on, yield and protein go up. That's not the surprising part. But the surprising part is that the varieties tended to differ a little bit, and that economic analysis will hopefully tell us what's the best practice. So protein increased and his end use quality went up as well. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, didn't this guy just say that higher protein doesn't necessarily ensure higher quality? The issue is that there was probably some hidden protein deficiencies in some of these varieties where they actually needed to be a little more than 14%. That's not really your problem. That's the problem for the milling and baking industry. But the variety response was different. That's the take-home message. So as we look at tailoring these management packages in the future and really trying to maximize yields, understanding how these varieties tend to do with nitrogen, whether they favor yield, protein, or they can find a way to do both, is going to be critical. If you've got any questions or complaints you're not afraid to ask in front of a group, fire away.